They say power reveals itself in loud rooms, boardrooms, headlines, and victories everyone can see. But real power sits quietly at the table, wearing something no one respects, waiting for the moment when truth doesn't need to raise its voice. Daniel Mercer had spent 30 years building something no one could take from him. Not because it was impossible, but because he made sure anyone who tried would misunderstand him first. So when his son-in-law invited him to dinner, Daniel already knew this wasn't a family gathering. It was a move. What they didn't know was that he had already made his. Daniel Mercer was the kind of man people forgot 5 minutes after meeting, not because he was unremarkable but because he chose to be. On most mornings, he could be found outside his modest house on the edge of a quiet town, watering a small row of plants that refused to grow evenly no matter how carefully he tended them. He wore the same faded jacket he'd owned for years, the sleeves slightly frayed, the fabric softened by time rather than replaced by money. And yet, if someone had looked closer, really looked, they might have noticed something didn't match. It was in the way he moved, not slowly, not weakly, but deliberately, like a man who had already made his decisions long before anyone else realized there was a choice. Daniel Mercer was the sole owner of a company that stretched across regions, industries, and systems most people didn't even know existed: logistics, infrastructure, supply chains. Quiet power. The kind that didn't need attention to function. The kind that preferred not to be seen. He had built it over 3 decades, piece by piece, after learning a lesson that had once cost him everything. And he had never forgotten it. His daughter, Elalina, was nothing like him. Where Daniel preferred silence, Elalina filled space effortlessly. She laughed easily, trusted quickly, and believed, perhaps too much, that people meant what they said. Daniel never corrected her. Some lessons could not be inherited. They had to be survived. When she introduced Adrian Hale to him 2 years ago, Daniel had already formed an opinion within seconds. Not a judgment, an observation. Adrian was polished, controlled, confident in the way people become when the world has never forced them to question themselves too deeply. He shook Daniel's hand with just the right amount of pressure, smiled at just the right moment, and spoke as if every sentence had been rehearsed inside him first. Daniel had seen that before many times. Didn't make Adrian a bad man, but it meant he hadn't been tested yet. And that was always where the truth lived. So Daniel did what he always did. He watched quietly, carefully, without interference. When Elalina told him she was serious about Adrian, Daniel nodded, said very little, and made a decision that would change everything. Though no one at that table realized it at the time, not even Elalina. Certainly not Adrian. Because 3 months later, Adrian Hale received an offer that would redefine his life. A CEO position at a rapidly growing company with influence far beyond what appeared publicly. Process had been rigorous, competitive, and on the surface entirely legitimate. Adrian believed he had earned it, and to be fair, he mostly had. What he didn't know was that every step of that process had been quietly shaped by a man who preferred not to be seen. Daniel Mercer. He never told him. Not because he was hiding, but because he was waiting. Waiting to see what a man does when he believes no one is watching. And more importantly, who he becomes when he finally realizes someone always was. There was a difference between power and control. Daniel understood both. And as he stood there that morning watering plants that refused to grow the way he wanted them to, he found himself thinking, not for the first time, that people rarely revealed themselves when life was easy. Real character revealed itself at the table when something was at stake. When silence felt heavier than speaking. When choices could not be undone. He didn't know exactly when that moment would come for Adrian, but he knew it would. It always did. And when it did, Daniel Mercer intended to be sitting close enough to see it clearly. Call came on a Thursday evening, just as the light outside Daniel Mercer's house began to soften into that quiet, uncertain gray between day and night. He was in the kitchen rinsing a cup he had already washed once before, not because it needed it, but because his hands preferred something simple to do. The phone buzzed against the wooden counter. Daniel glanced at the screen, already knowing who it was before he picked it up. Adrian Hale. He let it ring once more than necessary, then answered. Daniel. Adrian's voice came through, warm, steady, carefully measured. Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. You're catching me at a quiet one, Daniel replied. A soft chuckle from the other end. Polite, controlled, just enough to feel natural. There was always something about Adrian's tone that made Daniel listen a little closer than usual. Not because it was suspicious, but because it was practiced. I wanted to ask you something, Adrian continued. A brief pause followed, just long enough to feel intentional. My parents are in town this weekend. They've been wanting to meet you properly. Daniel didn't respond right away. Not outwardly. But something inside him shifted. Not alarm. Not even discomfort. Just that same faint sensation he had learned to respect over the years. The one that didn't shout, didn't panic, but leaned forward quietly and said, Pay attention. They've been asking about you, Adrian added. That was the part that didn't sit right. Daniel turned slightly, resting one hand on the edge of the counter, eyes drifting toward the window though he wasn't really looking at anything. Have they? He said. Yeah, Adrian replied. You know how parents are. They want to know who their son married into. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. In his experience, people rarely lied outright. They revealed themselves in the space between words. I thought we could all have dinner tomorrow night, Adrian said. There's a place downtown. Nothing too formal. Just a chance to sit together. Daniel almost smiled. He had heard that phrase before. It usually meant the opposite. What time? Daniel asked. 7, Adrian said quickly, as if relieved to hear agreement already forming. I'll send you the details. Daniel nodded once, though Adrian couldn't see it. All right, he said. I'll be there. Call ended a few seconds later, wrapped in the usual courtesies. But the quiet that followed felt different. Daniel set the phone down slowly, then didn't move. Kitchen seemed smaller somehow, the air denser, not heavy, just aware. He had spent 30 years building a life where surprises rarely reached him unannounced. And yet, this didn't feel like a surprise. Felt like something approaching, something that had been moving toward him for a long time, finally close enough to take shape. Daniel walked over to the sink, turned off the water he had forgotten was still running, and dried his hands on a cloth that had seen better days. His reflection appeared briefly in the window. A man most people would overlook without a second thought. That had always been the point. But invisibility, he had learned, only worked when you controlled the moment it ended. And something told him this dinner was going to be that moment. He didn't know exactly what Adrian's parents wanted, but he knew this. People don't ask to meet you after years of silence unless they've already decided something about you. And people don't choose restaurants for simple dinners unless they want the setting to matter. Daniel stepped outside onto the porch. The evening air felt cool against his skin. The sky above was dimming, colors fading into something quieter, more honest. He preferred this time of day. Nothing pretended to be more than it was. He leaned lightly against the railing, eyes unfocused, mind already moving. Not quickly, not anxiously, just forward. There were patterns to things like this. Invitations that came too late, conversations that arrived too carefully, silences that felt rehearsed. Daniel had seen enough of them to understand one simple truth. When someone invites you to a table like that, the decision has already been made. The only question left is whether they think you've noticed. He exhaled slowly, almost a laugh, but not quite. Not yet. Because whatever this was, it wasn't random and it wasn't harmless, but it also wasn't unexpected. Not really. Daniel Mercer didn't avoid situations like this. He walked into them on purpose. 'Cause there was something most people never understood until it was too late. A trap only works if you don't see it before you step inside. And Daniel had already decided he was going. The restaurant was exactly what Daniel Mercer expected. Which was to say, it wasn't simple. Soft lighting hung low from carefully spaced fixtures, casting a warm glow that made everything look intentional. Kind of place where even silence felt curated. Glassware caught reflections like it mattered. Conversation stayed just below a certain volume, as if the room itself enforced restraint. Daniel paused briefly at the entrance, not out of hesitation but observation. Every detail told a story, and this one said, "Control the environment, control the moment." Adrian was already waiting near the door. He looked precise, tailored jacket, clean lines, posture straight but not stiff. There was a readiness to him tonight, something slightly sharpened beneath the surface. When he saw Daniel, his expression shifted into something familiar, polite, welcoming, rehearsed. "You made it," Adrian said, stepping forward. Daniel nodded once. "You chose well." Adrian smiled. "I thought you'd like it." Daniel didn't answer that. Liking it had nothing to do with why he was here. They walked inside together. Adrian led the way, but not confidently enough to hide that he had checked the layout before Daniel arrived. His pace was just a fraction too measured. Another small detail. Another quiet note filed away. Table was already set. 3 people were seated. They stood almost immediately when Daniel approached. That too was deliberate. The man extended his hand first. "Daniel," he said warmly. "I'm Victor Hale." The handshake came with both hands, firm in its closing. Kind meant to signal sincerity or establish dominance. Daniel met it evenly. "Good to meet you," he replied. The woman beside Victor smiled, her expression bright, but just a second too early, as if she had prepared it before Daniel reached the table. "Elaine," she said, touching his arm lightly. "We've heard so much about you." Daniel held her gaze for a brief moment. "Have you?" he said. There was no challenge in his voice, but there didn't need to be. They sat. Adrian took his place slightly off-center. Not quite between the two sides, but close enough to feel the tension from both. Daniel noticed the positioning immediately. Unintentional placements were rare at tables like this. Menus were handed out, water was poured, orders were placed, and through it all, conversation moved in that careful, measured way people use when they are building toward something. Victor asked about Daniel's home. Elaine commented on the town. Adrian spoke about work, but only in general terms, carefully avoiding anything too specific, as if still maintaining a boundary he believed was necessary. Daniel answered simply and briefly. He gave them nothing unnecessary. And in return, he watched everything. There was a rhythm to the table, but it wasn't natural. It was constructed. The laughter came a second too late. Pauses lasted just a fraction too long. And beneath it all, there was something waiting. Daniel could feel it, not as tension exactly, but as intention. 40 minutes passed like that, between courses, between glances, between things not said. And just as the table settled into that dangerous illusion of comfort, Victor reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately. He pulled out an envelope, cream-colored, thick, the kind that didn't belong in a casual dinner. He placed it on the table between them. Not pushed, not handed, placed. As if its presence alone was enough. Conversation stopped. Not abruptly, but completely. Elaine lifted her glass but didn't drink. Adrian looked down. And that, more than anything, told Daniel what he needed to know. Because people only look away like that when they already understand what's about to happen. Daniel let his gaze fall to the envelope, then back to Victor. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. Victor folded his hands together, leaning forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to signal a shift. "Daniel," he said, "there are some things about the past that we believe need to be addressed." There it was. Not the accusation, not the demand, just the door opening. Daniel felt something inside him settle. Not tighten, not react, just align. 'Cause moments like this didn't arrive unexpectedly. They revealed themselves, and once they did, everything became clearer. He reached for his glass, took a slow sip of water, then set it down carefully. The sound it made against the table was soft, but in the silence, it carried. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes steady, voice calm. "Before we go any further," he said, "I think you should understand something." Victor smiled faintly. Confident, certain, like a man who believed he had prepared for every possible outcome. "I'm listening," he said. Daniel held his gaze. And for the briefest moment, something almost like amusement passed through his eyes. Not arrogance, not mockery, just recognition. Because after 30 years, he had learned one thing better than anything else. You don't sit down at a table like this unless you already know what's been placed in front of you. The envelope remained unopened, and somehow that mattered more than anything inside it. It sat between them like something alive. Not moving, not speaking, but present in a way that made everything else feel secondary. Daniel Mercer didn't reach for it. He let it stay exactly where Victor Hale had placed it, untouched, unclaimed. Because in moments like this, the first person to move was usually the one who misunderstood the situation. Victor noticed. Of course he did. Men like him always watched for that. And when Daniel didn't take the bait, Victor adjusted. Not visibly, not enough for most people to see, but Daniel saw it. A slight tightening around the eyes, a shift in posture, the smallest crack in the performance. "Go ahead," Victor said, gesturing lightly toward the envelope. "You should see what's inside." Daniel's gaze didn't follow the gesture. It stayed on Victor. "I'm more interested in hearing it from you," Daniel replied. A pause. Short, measured, but no longer comfortable. Elaine set her glass down gently, fingers lingering on the stem just a moment too long, as if anchoring herself to something steady. Adrian still hadn't looked up. Victor leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, a controlled release, like a man deciding to move to the next step of a plan. "Very well," he said. His tone changed. Not dramatically, but enough, less warmth, more intention. "My family," Victor began, "has spent a long time living with the consequences of something that happened years ago." Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't react. He simply listened and waited. "You may remember a man named Thomas Hale," Victor continued. "My older brother." There it was. Not the full story, just the name. Placed carefully, watched closely. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Not surprise, recognition. Old, familiar, and very far from finished. Victor noticed that too and mistook it. "I see that you do," he said, a faint edge entering his voice. "Then you already understand why we're here." Daniel said nothing, so Victor continued. 30 years ago, my brother was forced out of a company he helped build. A company that, from what we've come to understand, became quite successful. A subtle emphasis on the last word, not admiration, but accusation. "He lost everything," Victor added. "His career, his reputation, his future." Elaine leaned forward slightly, her voice softer but no less deliberate. "Our family paid the price for that," she said. 4 years. Daniel let the words settle. Not because they affected him, but because he wanted to hear how far they would go. Victor's eyes sharpened. "And now," he said, "we finally have the opportunity to understand what really happened." Daniel's gaze flickered briefly toward the envelope, then back. "And what is it you think happened?" he asked. Question landed differently than Victor expected. Not defensive, not dismissive, just precise. Victor straightened slightly. "As I said," he replied, "you should read the documents." He tapped the envelope once lightly. "Everything is in there. Records, statements, a clear picture of how my brother was manipulated, threatened, and ultimately forced out of something he built." Adrian's hand tightened slightly against the table. Small but visible. Daniel noticed. Filed it away. Victor leaned forward again, lowering his voice. "We're not here to create a scene," he said. "We're here to resolve something that's been left unresolved for far too long." There it was, the shift from past to present, from story to demand. Daniel tilted his head slightly. And what resolution would that be? Victor didn't hesitate. I want you to step away, he said, from any remaining involvement in that company. A beat. And we expect a financial settlement, he added, an amount that reflects what was taken from my family. Silence followed. Not awkward, not uncertain, just still. Because what Victor had just done was place a price on something he didn't fully understand. Daniel let his eyes rest on him for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled. Not wide, not obvious, but enough. Enough to make something shift in the air. You've come a long way, Daniel said quietly, to ask for something you believe already belongs to you. Victor's expression hardened. This isn't a belief, he replied. It's evidence. Daniel's gaze dropped briefly to the envelope again, then back. And you're certain? He said. That's what's in there tells the whole story? Victor held his stare. Yes. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Calm, unmoved, as if the conversation had finally reached a point he had been waiting for. Across the table, Adrian slowly lifted his head. His eyes moved from his father to Daniel and back again. There was something different in his expression now. Not confidence, not control, something closer to doubt. Because for the first time that evening, the story he thought he understood no longer felt complete. And Daniel hadn't even opened the envelope yet. Daniel Mercer finally reached for the envelope. Not quickly, not reluctantly, just when it was time. His fingers brushed the edge of the thick paper, feeling its weight before lifting it from the table. It was heavier than it needed to be. That was intentional. People often believed weight added credibility. Daniel opened it slowly, sliding out the documents inside with the kind of care that suggested respect, not for what they contained, but for what they were trying to become, a weapon. He didn't read immediately. Instead, his eyes settled on the name printed at the top of the first page, Thomas Hale. And just like that, the past didn't return. It unfolded. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise, like a door that had never really been closed. 30 years earlier, Daniel had been a different man. Not poorer in money, but in understanding. Back then, ambition had felt clean, simple, forward-moving. He and Thomas had built something together from nothing more than long hours and shared belief. A small operation barely noticeable in a city that didn't care whether they succeeded or disappeared. And for a while it worked. That was the dangerous part. 'Cause success, even small success, has a way of disguising cracks. Daniel remembered the first time something didn't feel right. It hadn't been obvious, just a number that didn't match, a delay that didn't make sense, a conversation that ended too quickly. He had ignored it, not because he was blind, but because trust is quieter than suspicion. And at the time, he still believed trust was something that protected you. It wasn't. By the time Daniel understood what was happening, it wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. Thomas had been moving things, small amounts at first, careful enough to avoid attention, then larger, bolder, until the structure they had built together no longer belonged to both of them. It belonged to whoever was willing to take it. Daniel didn't confront him immediately. That was never his way. Instead, he watched, listened, collected, not out of anger but out of certainty. 'Cause once you know something is broken, the only thing that matters is understanding how. 6 months. That's how long Daniel spent putting the truth together. Every transaction, every transfer, every quiet decision Thomas thought no one would notice. And when the picture was complete, Daniel sat down across from him. At a table much smaller than this one, with no witnesses, no performance, no envelope, just truth. He had given Thomas a choice: walk away, give up everything he had taken, disappear quietly, or face what came next. Not revenge, consequences. Thomas chose to leave. Daniel remembered the silence after that meeting more clearly than anything else. Not relief, not victory, just absence. Because something had ended and something else had begun. Part where trust no longer came easily or maybe didn't come at all. Daniel blinked once, the present returning not as a shift but as a continuation. The restaurant, the table, the people across from him. He looked up from the page. Victor Hale was watching him closely, waiting, not just for a reaction but for confirmation, for the past to behave the way he believed it should. Daniel studied him for a moment, not unkindly but carefully. There was something familiar in Victor's expression. Not the anger, not the confidence, something deeper, something inherited. A story carried long enough to feel like truth. Daniel understood that more than Victor realized. "I'm sorry about your brother," Daniel said quietly. The words landed gently, but they didn't soften anything. Victor's jaw tightened. "I'm not here for sympathy," he replied. "I didn't think you were," Daniel said. A brief silence followed. Different from before. Less controlled, more exposed. Victor leaned forward again. "Then you understand why this needs to be resolved," he said. Daniel closed the folder slowly, placing it back on the table. "Yes," he said. "I do." But the way he said it wasn't agreement. It was clarity. Because what Victor believed was unfinished had already been decided a long time ago. The only thing left now was whether the truth would be allowed to stay buried or finally be brought into the light. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the table, his gaze steady. And for the first time that evening, there was something beneath his palm. Not anger, not tension, just a quiet, unmistakable thought. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. Some people don't inherit the truth. They inherit the version that hurts less, and they will defend it until someone shows them what it cost. Daniel Mercer didn't reach for his glass this time. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't even look at the envelope again because the moment for reacting had already passed. Now was the moment for correction. He placed both hands lightly on the table, not as a gesture of control but of stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't invite interruption. Victor Hale was watching him closely, waiting, expecting resistance, argument, denial. That was the mistake. Daniel didn't offer any of those. Instead, he spoke. "Victor," he said calmly, "what you've brought here tonight," he glanced once at the envelope, "is incomplete." The word landed softly, but it didn't leave room for interpretation. Victor's expression tightened slightly. "Incomplete," he repeated. "Those documents are very clear." "I'm sure they are," Daniel replied. And then he reached into his own jacket. The movement was unhurried, unremarkable, but it changed everything. Because unlike Victor's gesture earlier, this one didn't ask for attention. It assumed it. Daniel placed a second envelope on the table. Smaller, plain, no weight to it at all. And yet, the moment it touched the surface, the air shifted. Victor's eyes dropped to it immediately. Elaine's fingers stilled against her glass. Adrian finally looked up. "This," Daniel continued, resting his hand lightly beside the envelope, "is what your brother chose not to keep." No one spoke, so Daniel opened it himself. Not for effect, for clarity. He slid a set of documents out and laid the first page flat against the table, turning it just enough for Victor to see. "Original account records," Daniel said. "Joint accounts, 1989 to 1991. Victor didn't move, but his eyes did, quickly, carefully reading without admitting it. Daniel placed a second document beside the first. "Wire transfers," he added. "Repeated withdrawals to a company registered under your sister-in-law's maiden name." A third page. "Internal correspondence, not summaries, originals." His voice remained even, steady, almost patient, as if he had done this before. Because he had. "Your brother wasn't forced out," Daniel said. "He was given a choice." Victor's head lifted slightly. Confidence in his posture didn't disappear, but it shifted. Subtly. "According to who?" he asked. Daniel met his gaze. "According to the records he didn't think anyone else would find." A pause. Then Daniel added, and according to a man who is still very much alive. That landed differently. Victor blinked once. An accountant, Daniel continued. 71 years old. He handled every transaction your brother made during that period. He remembers them clearly. The silence at the table deepened. Not empty, not neutral, but changing. Victor's fingers pressed lightly against the table. Not enough to be obvious. Enough to reveal pressure. That doesn't prove anything, he said. But this time it sounded like he was speaking to himself as much as to Daniel. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He let the moment sit. Let it stretch just enough to expose what was underneath. Then he spoke again. It proves, he said, that the story you were given, he paused, not for emphasis but for accuracy, was edited. Victor exhaled sharply through his nose. Anger not loud but present. You expect me to believe that? He said. Daniel's expression didn't change. I don't expect anything from you, he replied. And that was the truth. 'Cause belief wasn't the point. Evidence was. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Not retreating, just creating space. Grief has a way of simplifying things, he said quietly. It removes details that are inconvenient. It reshapes events into something easier to carry. Elaine looked down. For the first time that evening, she didn't speak. Victor remained still. But something in his eyes had shifted. Not acceptance, not yet, but uncertainty. And uncertainty was where everything began to change. Across the table, Adrian's gaze moved slowly between them. His father, Daniel, the documents. His expression no longer held confidence or distance. It held something else now, something sharper, something more dangerous. Understanding. Because for the first time he wasn't being told a story. He was watching it unravel. Daniel folded his hands loosely, calm, unmoved, as if the outcome of this moment had never really been in question. Your brother made his decisions, he said, and I made mine. Quiet pause followed. Then almost gently, Daniel added, what you do with the truth now is yours. Silence settled over the table again, but this time it wasn't controlled. It wasn't part of anyone's plan. It had weight now, the kind that presses down on people until something underneath begins to crack. Victor Hale didn't look at Daniel anymore. He looked at the documents, not fully, not directly, but enough. Enough to know they existed. Enough to understand they didn't match the version of the past he had carried for most of his life. His jaw tightened, then released, then tightened again. It was the smallest visible struggle, but it was there. Elaine shifted in her seat, her fingers wrapping around her glass as if it might steady something inside her that had begun to move. No one reached for food. No one spoke. And in that silence, something shifted at the far end of the table. Adrian. He straightened slowly, his posture changing not as a reaction but as a decision. Daniel noticed it immediately. 'Cause there's a difference between someone who is uncomfortable and someone who is beginning to understand. Adrian's eyes moved to his father. Dad, he said. The word broke the silence cleanly, not loud, not sharp, but undeniable. Victor didn't respond right away. He kept his gaze forward, as if not looking would delay what came next. Dad, Adrian repeated, this time more firmly. Victor exhaled, leaning back slightly, his expression attempting to reassemble itself into something controlled. Not now, he said. It was meant to end the conversation. It didn't. Adrian shook his head once. No, he said quietly. Now. That word carried something new. Not defiance for the sake of emotion, but clarity. And clarity doesn't step back once it arrives. Victor turned to him slowly. There was irritation in his eyes now, and something else, something closer to concern. You don't understand the full picture, Victor said. There are things I understand enough, Adrian interrupted. That changed everything. Because Adrian had not interrupted once that evening, Not when the envelope appeared, not when the accusations were made, not even when Daniel began to dismantle them. But now he did. And that meant something inside him had crossed the line. Elaine leaned forward slightly. "Adrian," she raised a hand. Not aggressively, just enough. And she stopped. Table held its breath. Adrian looked back at his father. "How long?" he asked. Victor frowned slightly. "What?" "How long have you known?" Adrian said. Question was precise. Not emotional. Not scattered. Directed. Victor hesitated, only for a second. But it was enough. "I found out years ago," he said. "After you told me the company name. I did some research before I married Elalina." Adrian asked. Victor didn't answer. And that was the answer. Adrian nodded once, slowly processing, not the information but what it meant. "You positioned me," he said. The words came out flat. Controlled, but underneath them something was breaking. Victor leaned forward. "I protected you." "No," Adrian said. He shook his head again, this time more firmly. "You used me." The air in the room shifted instantly. Elaine inhaled sharply. "Adrian, that's not." "Don't," he said quietly, not harsh but final. She stopped. Victor's expression hardened. "Everything I did was for this family," he said. Adrian held his gaze. "And what exactly was I supposed to do?" he asked. "Sit here while you try to force him into something based on a story that doesn't even hold up anymore?" Victor's voice rose slightly. "That man destroyed your uncle." "Did he?" Adrian cut in. Question hung there, sharp, uncomfortable, unavoidable. Because now it wasn't Daniel speaking. It wasn't evidence. It was doubt. And doubt is far more dangerous than proof. Victor opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time that evening, he didn't have something ready. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, not retreating, just creating distance from the conversation, from the situation, from the version of reality he had been handed his entire life. Daniel said nothing. Not because he didn't have anything to add, but because he understood something most people didn't. This moment didn't belong to him. Belonged to Adrian. To the point where a man stops inheriting beliefs and starts choosing what he's willing to stand on. Victor looked at his son. Really looked this time. And what he saw was no longer someone he could guide or control. It was someone who had stepped out of the story he had written for him. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was final. 'Cause once truth enters a room like this, it doesn't argue. It waits. And it watches who's strong enough to accept it. Across the table, Adrian's eyes moved once more from his father to Daniel. And in that glance, there was no longer distance, no longer uncertainty, just one question left unspoken. And Daniel knew the next moment would change everything. Daniel Mercer didn't speak immediately. He let the silence remain exactly where it was, uninterrupted, because moments like this didn't need to be rushed. They needed to be understood. Across the table, Adrian was still looking at him, not with suspicion, not even confusion anymore, but with something far more precise. Expectation. Daniel recognized it. It was the look of someone who had just realized the story wasn't finished, and was ready, whether he admitted it or not, to hear the rest. Daniel reached for his glass, took a slow sip of water, then set it down with quiet care. The sound was small, but in the stillness it carried. "Adrian," he said calmly. "Tell me something." Adrian straightened slightly. Instinct. The reflex of someone used to answering questions in rooms where answers mattered. "What do you know about how you got your position?" Daniel asked. Question landed gently. But it wasn't simple. Adrian blinked once, caught slightly off guard. "I was recruited," he said. "Executive search firm, multiple interviews, board approval." He paused briefly, as if replaying it in his mind. "It was competitive," he added. "I earned it." Daniel nodded once. You did, he said. And he meant it. Adrian frowned slightly. Something didn't connect. Why are you asking me that? He said. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward just enough to shift the space between them. Not aggressively, but intentionally. The firm that contacted you, Daniel said, was hired by me. The words landed softly, but they didn't stay that way. Adrian's expression didn't change immediately. Paused, like something inside him had stopped processing. Daniel continued. The board you interviewed with reports to me, he said. Every decision they made came through me. Victor's head turned sharply. Elaine froze, but Daniel didn't look at them. His attention remained exactly where it belonged, on Adrian. The role you've held for the last 14 months, Daniel said, exists inside a company that I own. A short, unsteady breath from Adrian. Daniel held his gaze. I've owned it, he added, for the last 30 years. Silence. Not the kind that invites response, the kind that removes it. Adrian stared at him, not blinking, not moving, just trying to reconcile something that didn't fit. He started, but the sentence didn't finish. Daniel spared him the effort. Daniel Mercer, he said simply. Founder, sole owner. The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. 'Cause truth, real truth, doesn't require volume. It requires time. And Adrian needed a moment. Daniel gave it to him. Across the table, Victor had gone completely still. Not controlled, not composed. Still, like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't what he thought it was. Elaine's hand moved slightly toward her glass, then stopped. No one reached for anything now because nothing in that room felt stable anymore. Adrian finally moved. A slow exhale. A hand through his hair. His eyes dropped briefly to the table, then lifted again. Back to Daniel. You're telling me, he said carefully, that I've been running your company? Daniel nodded once. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Because now it wasn't just information. It was reality rearranging itself. Adrian leaned back in his chair slightly. Not retreating, just absorbing, processing, rebuilding. Why? He asked. Question came out quieter than before. Stripped of performance, just a man asking something real. Daniel considered him for a moment. Not as an employee, not as a son-in-law, just as he was. I wanted to see who you were, Daniel said. The answer was simple, but it wasn't small. Not when people were watching, he continued. Not when you thought something was at stake. His gaze didn't waver. But when you believed everything you had was already yours. Adrian swallowed once. Victor shifted in his seat, finally reacting. He started. Daniel didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge him. Because this moment still didn't belong to him. Belonged to Adrian. To be clear, Daniel said calmly, nothing about your position was unearned that mattered. And everything you've done in that role was yours, he added. Adrian held his gaze, searching for doubt, for manipulation, for something that would make this easier to reject. He didn't find it because there was nothing there but truth. And truth doesn't give you an exit. Gives you a choice. Daniel leaned back slightly. Calm, unmoved, certain. 'Cause the reveal was never the end of something. It was the beginning. And as Adrian sat there between the man who raised him and the man who had been watching him all along, Daniel knew one thing with absolute clarity. What happened next would define him far more than anything that came before. For a long moment, no one moved. Not because they didn't know what to do, but because whatever came next would not be reversible. Adrian Hale sat between two versions of truth, one he had been raised with, one he had just been shown, and for the first time in his life, neither of them could be accepted without consequence. He lowered his gaze briefly, not in avoidance, but in focus. His hands rested on the table, fingers loosely interlocked, as if anchoring himself to something steady while everything else shifted. Then he looked up, not at Daniel but at his father. Victor Hale met his son's eyes, and for the first time that evening there was no performance left, no warmth, no strategy, just something raw, something uncertain. "Adrian," Victor said, his voice quieter now. "You need to understand this is not as simple as he's making it sound." Adrian held his gaze. "I know," he said. The response was calm, measured, but it didn't carry agreement. Victor leaned forward slightly, urgency replacing control. "Your uncle lost everything," he said. "Everything? And this man?" "Dad," Adrian interrupted. Not sharply, but firmly enough to stop the sentence. Victor froze, because there was something in Adrian's tone now. Something unfamiliar. It wasn't anger. It wasn't rebellion. It was separation. Adrian exhaled slowly. "I believed you," he said. The words landed heavier than anything that had been said before. Not because they accused, but because they acknowledged. Victor's expression shifted. "I raised you on that story," Adrian continued. "I trusted it. I carried it." A pause. "And I never questioned it." Elaine's eyes lowered again. Victor said nothing. Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting, not to escape but to think. "When I came here tonight," he said, "I thought this was about settling something unfinished." His eyes returned to Daniel. "Now I realize it was about something else." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to, because Adrian had already begun answering his own question. Adrian's gaze moved back to his father. "You didn't tell me everything," he said. Victor's jaw tightened. "I told you what mattered," he replied. Adrian shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "You told me what supported what you wanted." The distinction hung in the air. Clear. Unavoidable. Victor's voice hardened again. "I did what I had to do for this family." Adrian's expression didn't change. "And where was I in that?" he asked. Question wasn't loud, but it cut deeper than anything else. Victor didn't answer immediately, and that silence said more than anything he could have. Adrian nodded once, slowly, as if something inside him had just settled into place. Not comfortably, but definitively. He turned slightly in his seat, not toward Daniel fully, but enough. "I should have said something earlier," he said. Daniel watched him. "You didn't know enough yet," he replied. Adrian gave a small, almost absent nod. Then he looked back at his father. This time there was no hesitation. "No," he said. "I'm not doing this." Victor frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not part of this," Adrian said. "Not the pressure, not the demand. Not the version of the past that doesn't hold up when it's actually examined." Elaine inhaled sharply. "Adrian." He shook his head again. "I'm serious." Victor's expression darkened. "You're choosing him?" he asked. Question came out sharper than intended. But it wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Adrian met his gaze. "I'm choosing what's real," he said. Silence. Not empty. Final. Victor leaned back slowly in his chair. The fight didn't leave him, but something else did. Certainty. Because for the first time, he wasn't just facing Daniel. He was facing his son and losing both. Adrian exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders easing. Not because the situation was resolved, but because his role in it finally was. He looked at Daniel again. There was no apology in his expression. No attempt to repair something prematurely. Just clarity. "I don't know what happens next," Adrian said. Daniel nodded once. "That's fair." Adrian held his gaze for a moment longer, then leaned back slightly, his hands returning to the table, no longer tense. The decision had been made, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And across the table, Daniel Mercer saw it clearly, not the choice itself, but what it meant. Because a man doesn't reveal who he is when everything is given to him. He reveals it when something has to be chosen and something else has to be left behind. Tension didn't disappear, didn't dissolve into relief or soften into resolution. Simply settled like dust after something has already broken. Victor Hale sat back in his chair, his posture no longer composed, no longer deliberate. The edges of control he had carried into the room had worn thin, leaving something quieter behind. Not defeat, not acceptance, just the absence of certainty. Elaine remained still beside him, her gaze lowered, her hands folded together in a way that suggested she had already stepped out of the conversation, even if her body remained at the table. And Adrian no longer looked divided. That was the most noticeable change. He wasn't leaning toward either side anymore. He wasn't searching for something to hold on to. He had already let go. Daniel Mercer watched all of it without moving. Not with satisfaction, not with pride, just with understanding. Because what had happened here tonight wasn't a victory in the way most people defined it. There was no triumph, no visible collapse. No one had raised their voice. And yet, everything had changed. Daniel reached for his glass, taking one final sip of water before setting it down. The sound was soft, final. He looked at Victor. "I'm not going to pursue anything against you," he said. Victor didn't respond immediately. He simply looked up, his expression tightening slightly as if preparing for something sharper. But it didn't come. Daniel's voice remained calm. "Not because I can't," he continued, "but because I understand something you're still holding on to." A pause. "Your brother didn't just lose a business," Daniel said. "He lost the version of himself he believed in." Victor's jaw shifted. Daniel didn't press. He didn't need to. "People don't let go of that easily," he added. The words weren't offered as comfort. They were offered as truth. And truth, when it's quiet, has a way of staying longer. Victor looked down at the table. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, explain, defend, push back. But he didn't. 'Cause there was nothing left to position, nothing left to control, only something left to reconsider. Daniel shifted his gaze slightly to Adrian. "The position you're in," he said, "doesn't change." Adrian held his eyes. Daniel continued, "You've done your job well. That's the only reason it matters." Adrian nodded once, not in relief but in acknowledgement. Because this wasn't a reward. It was confirmation. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, allowing the space between them to open again. "The rest," he said, "we'll discuss later. Properly." Adrian understood. This wasn't the end of a conversation. It was the beginning of a different one. Victor slowly reached for his napkin, folding it with care before placing it beside his plate. The movement was quiet, deliberate, the kind people make when they've run out of things to hold on to. "We should go," he said. His voice had lost its edge. Elaine nodded. Neither of them looked at Daniel again. Victor stood, pausing briefly beside Adrian. There was something he might have said, something that had lived in him for years. But it didn't come out. "Later," he said instead. Adrian didn't stop him. Didn't follow. He simply nodded once, and that said everything. They left. No scene, no final words, just absence. Daniel watched them go, not with interest, but with closure. 'Cause some things don't need to be finished loudly. They just need to end. Table felt different now. Lighter, but not empty. Adrian exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally releasing in a way that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with the decision he had made. Daniel glanced at him. "You'll be fine," he said. Adrian let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "I hope so." Daniel stood, reaching for his jacket. "You will," he said, "because now you're paying attention." They walked out together, not as employer and employee, not as father-in-law and son-in-law. Just two men leaving a table where something had been revealed. Outside, the night air was cooler, quieter, honest. Daniel paused briefly before heading toward his car. There was no rush, no lingering wait, just the steady rhythm of something that had already been decided long before this evening began. He had built his life that way, not for control, not for power, but for something simpler. Something most people misunderstand until it's too late. As he opened the car door, one final thought settled in his mind. A clear, complete, and entirely his own. Some people build empires to prove they can't be taken from. Others build them so when someone tries, they already know exactly how the story ends.